Hello my loves, welcome back to another episode of Unfollowing Mum. I am going to try and be a little bit more consistent moving forwards because I know that I missed last week. However, I have had a really busy time at the minute and I've been finalising a project I am so excited to share with you and will be sharing with you soon. Anyway, jumping into this week's episode, I had absolutely no idea what I was going to share with you this week and I went to empty the bins. It was typical procrastination, putting off what I wanted to do. I knew I needed to do this morning. I wanted to start recording a podcast episode so I could get one live for you guys today. And then I started to procrastinate. And I do this all the time. I don't know if it's my ADHD or if it's just me. And that's absolutely fine. But I was telling myself as I was doing it, right, you're going to do this and then you're going to go and you're going to sit down and you're going to start recording because you need to do that. And that's on your to-do list today. We're going to stop procrastinating, even though these are useful jobs. I was emptying the cat litter trays and then I was emptying the bin. And then the bin bag split on me. And when I tell you, I was so raging. I flicked my slipper off my foot, lobbed it across the room, and it just, you know, when something just is so anticlimactic and flops on the floor, almost as if to say, you are being really pathetic here. Get a grip of yourself, woman. And it just, I sat there and started to pick all this up. And I said to my husband when he came through, he was like, what are you doing? Well, I said, I don't even know what I'm going to talk about today on the podcast. He went, why don't you talk about this? Talk about cat shit. So I'm going to talk about that, but not that. That sparked the idea for me of how this feeling of anger can bubble up in us. And it's so frustrating and overwhelming. And almost, I have a really funny relationship with anger. It's a feeling that I'm not keen on feeling in myself. I think that makes sense. And I'm hoping that you can relate to some of what I've said because I think this relates back to something that I was talking about on my page, my Unfollowing Mum Instagram page last week. And I'd shared this infograph that it was by a company called Reflectio, and it was talking all about our trauma responses. And I shared it in particular because it's one of the first times that I have seen something that acknowledges the flop trauma response. And I thought it was really interesting to discuss why the majority of people kind of just leave that in the freeze phase. And if you haven't learned anything about polyvagal responses, which is what we're talking about here, and the trauma responses that are out there, I do have other episodes on that. But what I would say is to recap, when you think about your polyvagal response and your trauma response, we're talking about what you would classically know as fight or flight. But there are also other responses that we have in there, such as fawn, which is where we become the people pleaser, the person who wants to essentially fawn to someone else. And it was interesting, someone actually commented and said, well, a lot of trauma-informed therapists and counsellors now use appease instead of fawn because they find the word fawn quite confronting. I actually feel like fawn, for me, feels much more authentic. Because that's what I do. I was stuck in fawn for such a long time with my mother, and I would always fawn to her. I would go to the point where I would follow her around if I knew she was angry with me, and I would try and make it better, or if I knew she needed me to stay out the way. I remember being a very small child and writing her notes that say, I love you, I'm sorry, I'm so bad, those kind of things. They are fawning to someone and they're trying to get them to love you, and I don't feel like that appease really hits the nail of how desperately hard you are trying to get someone to love you. And I've noticed that as a thread throughout all of my relationships, where when I have been sitting in an unhealed place and I've been sitting in a trauma response, the main thing that I am trying to do is to get the other person to love me, to show me love, to be affectionate with me, to forgive me for some perceived wrong when I'm not in the wrong myself. All of those things to me feel very much like fawning, not necessarily appeasing. But if appease feels more comfortable to you or more authentic to you, that's okay. And then this diagram that you'll be able to see on my Instagram page, it was posted back on the 29th of April, also mentioned freeze, which is another part of our trauma response that we don't talk about so often. Now, those fall within trauma-led communities and circles would be really well discussed. You know, we will discuss fight, flight, freeze and fawn all the time. But what we don't discuss is flop. And flop is kind of sitting just beyond freeze. And in a lot of polyvagal theory diagrams where we talk about trauma responses, people will include flop in there. So for your freeze state, which goes just beyond where you have fight, flight and fawn, your freeze state is when you have that difficulty making decisions, you become stuck and you can disassociate, you isolate yourself, you feel frozen in time. And then just beyond that, which again some people will combine the two together, you have people who faint, people who become completely paralysed with fear, that immobility, that you just cannot move, you can't do anything. You know, when you talk about people who've been through truly horrific experiences and they've just disassociated in their mind, but their body has been so frozen they physically can't move, that's flop in action. To me, I feel like that still has a place in freeze, but I can understand why some circles, some counsellors, some coaches might want to create flop as an additional layer above that, because for freeze, I do feel like freeze has an area where we can mentally freeze. I find myself going into when I feel really threatened and I'm having a big argument and I feel really triggered and my trauma response crawls up. I can feel myself going into that way, almost like a thick-tongued feeling where you can't quite get your words out. You don't quite know what you want to say, or you know what you want to say, but it's just on the tip of your tongue and you can't make it come forwards, and your brain just feels like it's fragmenting and it just feels like you're so downtrodden, you feel slow, like you could almost go to sleep. That for me is how freeze comes out. And then flop, I can understand why that would take it to a next level. But for some people, those two come hand in hand. Their bodies freeze up. They find it difficult to breathe. For some people, they do pass out when they're overly stressed. So I think that the diagram I'd shared, I'd said how interesting I thought it was. The reason that this is relevant to this podcast episode is because of the way it addressed fight. So to read you out for flight, it said workaholic, overthinker, anxiety, panics, OCD, difficulty sitting still, perfectionist. All of those are things that I think the majority of us could agree would sit in a classic flight response. It is that flee to safety, you might overeat, become distracted, stay busy, perfectionists, people who have addictions. They're often all in flight response because they are trying to move themselves subconsciously or consciously away from whatever it is that is triggering those trauma responses. For fawn, it was, again, people pleasers, lacks of identity, no boundaries, feeling overwhelmed and codependent. They might attach for safety, become codependent, acquiesce to people, try and please people, be silent and repress themselves. Very much relate to fawn state. For me, anyway. You might relate to some of the others. For freeze, it was difficulty making decisions, stuck, disassociated, isolating, people who would describe themselves as scared stiff, shutting down, disassociated. Flop then went on to faint, paralysed by fear, tonic immobility may enhance survival, no perceived possibility of escaping. And I'm sure that some of us have been in those experiences where there is no perceived possibility of escape, and that's terrifying. And that's surrender for safety. They faint, they go limp, they lose physical control. When it came to fight response, it mentioned anger outbursts. Absolutely, we can all agree. Then it went on to say controlling, someone described as the bully, someone narcissistic, someone with explosive behaviour. And then it said they fight for safety, they rage, bully, become narcissistic. Now, I can agree with all of those things. That does not mean that people who have a fight response are automatically narcissistic or are automatically the bully or the narcissist. And somebody put it to me that anger is already really stigmatized, and that fight response is a display of anger, and that in itself calling someone who might have a fight response is terribly unfair. There is a bias towards other responses, and you see it commonly in the PTSD recovery community. And that fight might be a response people have because they fight hard when they are children, because they know that the emotional abuse is wrong and they don't see why they should be subjected to that ever. But people then make them feel like a bad victim. And I thought this was a really powerful comment, because I can see how people refer to others as bad victims. She'd gone on to say there are no such things. I'm not a worse victim than someone else who responds more passively or with less external anger. And whilst I absolutely agree with that statement, and she's 100% correct, there is no such thing as a bad victim. It's a victim responding with the tools that they've learned to stay safe. There is a responsibility to ourselves to heal and work through our traumas. And quite often we see people who allow those responses to take over, not doing that. When we think about someone who has narcissistic behaviours, that's been learned from somewhere. Think about what we know about narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. It comes as a trauma response. These are people who are stuck in almost toddler-like states because they're stuck in a trauma response, and part of that is a fight trauma response, whether we like it or not. And I think the biggest pushback to this infographic that I'd shared was the fact that it sounded like it was all the negative things pushed onto that fight response. The bully, the narcissistic behaviour, the explosive behaviour, and yet it's right. And it was really interesting that the people who were responding to me, some of them were becoming quite aggressive and quite angry, which is classic fight response. And I could understand why it was confronting. I'd mentioned to one person that I'd invite them to consider why they viewed fight response being framed in such a negative way. That certainly wasn't my reaction to it. I saw it and thought, yeah, I can agree that a lot of these behaviours that do come out can be angry, they can be unkind, they can be what we perceive as the bully, because it's almost a, well, I'm going to get you before you get me kind of response. It comes up shouting and screaming. We think about reactive abuse, for example. That is still abuse. It's still unacceptable, toxic behaviour. However, it's reactive. It is a reaction, a trauma response to being abused yourself. And that does not make it excusable. We have to be responsible for our trauma responses and ensure that they don't bleed onto other people. But it does make it understandable. And I'm very much a big believer in, if we can have understanding of the ways in which our parents behaved, the ways in which that now impacts us, we can use that to break the cycle. That does not mean we have to be forgiving. That does not mean that we have to excuse their behaviour, because they made an active choice not to acknowledge and work on their traumas. If you had a narcissistic parent like I did, she would quite often be really cruel and say horrible things or behave in an awful manner with silent treatment and all of the things that we've discussed on different episodes of the podcast. And yet, I can see and acknowledge that so much of her behaviour comes from a place of trauma and comes from her own unhealed, unresolved traumas, her own unhealed, unresolved generational patterns. That doesn't excuse it. And despite the fact that some of her responses would be fight, she always used to laugh that she had a really explosive temper, which she did, and that she would stamp like a billy goat. She thought it was hilarious. Now, to a small child, it was terrifying when you have a full-grown adult stamping in your direction, screeching at you because you've done something that they don't like. That's not fun, and that's not acceptable behaviour. It was her fight response, and I can hold those two truths together. And this person had said to me that anger could be really helpful and could be really healthy, which I agree. And I'd said, when we think about anger in a safe manner, it is powerful and can be useful to us. It's really important to validate and hear anger. I don't feel that the post demonises anger, but when we are dysregulated, which is what we would be in a trauma response, that isn't anger being expressed in a healthy manner. That isn't anger being expressed safely for you or the person that you might be expressing it to. You are dysregulated and you are in fight response. So I think we can hold those two truths there. Someone who is stuck in fight response, who becomes actively aggressive, who is angry, who may be what we would perceive as the bully, who has that I'm out to get everyone before they get me mentality, which can happen with someone stuck in fight response. It might be that your experience of being stuck in fight response is simply when someone pushes the wrong buttons, you completely lose your shit. And that's how your fight response comes out. And it's explosive anger. And then when you calm down, there is that internal shame around that anger. And I relate very heavily to that. That is my experience. I wouldn't go out of my way to be unkind to someone. I wouldn't go out of my way to create smear campaigns or any of these things because I don't have that side to me. I would, however, explode sometimes, and we'll come on to that in a bit because I think there is so much shame surrounding that. But it was really interesting to me how many people became deeply offended by the idea that someone who is abusive or who displays narcissistic behaviours, because again, remembering that narcissistic behaviours and being a narcissist or having NPD as a diagnosis are two different things. We all have narcissism within us. Some of us have unhealthy narcissistic behaviours. Doesn't mean we have a personality disorder. And I have different episodes again on that if that is something that you haven't heard about and that you're more interested in. But it was really interesting that so many people became so incensed by that. So let's go back to that shame that comes after we've had that explosive anger, if that's something that we want, because shame is such a complex thing that impacts people who have had toxic parents, who've had dysfunctional upbringings. I don't know anyone, nor have I ever worked with anyone who has had this kind of dysfunctional upbringing and doesn't experience toxic shame. And that doesn't matter whether or not they have a fight response, whether they have mixed feelings around anger, whether they feel shame because of their fawn response, whatever it is, it's toxic shame that sits at the root of it. I think the reason that so many people felt, for lack of a better word, triggered, and I don't say that in the "oh, you're triggered" kind of way that we so often see on social media, but that it brought up a response in it. That is what triggered should mean, is that it brings up that response for us. It makes us feel a particular type of way. It triggers some kind of response in us. And the reason that so many people, I feel, felt that way, seeing fight response as angry outbursts, someone who is a bully, someone who could be narcissistic. Again, remembering that it could be either or. It could be you have these explosive angers, you have this outburst, or you have bullying behaviours. It could be that you rage. It could be any of these things. But so many people found it confronting because of the shame that we feel when we do have these fight responses, and because of the way in which we are taught that anger is something that is inherently shameful, is something that's inherently bad, that we should shy away from anger. And that's not just on a toxic family level where everyone is often silenced, everyone has to walk on eggshells around one particular family member, everyone has to fall into the role that they are given, everyone has to comply with a particular narrative. But also on a societal level, when you talk about people who are angry, you see so many tropes that go through that narrative that utilise anger to dismiss, to diminish, to demonise. And yet, as that person said before, anger can be really helpful. Anger can be really important for us in order to get things done when expressed in a safe and healthy manner. So what we have to do is start addressing our relationship with anger, and this is something that I have had to work on myself and that I still work on constantly because I still feel a lot of fear around anger. You know, if I was angry with my mum or angry in relationships, then quite often I would suppress that, or I would silence it in some way, or I would allow it to fester away until it became this big explosive thing that would then cause days upon days of silent treatment, or would see me behaving in a way that I'm not proud of. And that goes back to that reactive abuse, that fight response, which is still not acceptable, and it is our responsibility to address. I remember so many occasions with my mum where I would snap back, or I would make some kind of comment that was angry and spiteful, and I would do it because she was pushing all of the buttons that she could possibly push. And especially as I came into my adulthood, when I recognised how challenging our relationship was and how abusive our relationship was, that reactive abuse from me, I certainly think, became more prevalent. And I've often said to my kids in particular, when they've asked questions around my relationship with my mum, that when I am with her, I am not a person that I like. And that comes down to that anger and not feeling free to express it in a safe, healthy manner, where I express it in a way that is unhealthy and is toxic and needs addressing and needs me working on it. One of the ways in which we can start to address that shame, and one of the ways in which I found really useful, is to look at our relationship with different emotions. So for me, looking at my relationship with anger, what does that mean for me? Who did I experience in my life who might have been angry, and what did that anger look like? Was it expressed in a healthy manner? What does anger mean for me? What does it mean in relation to how I've been treated? Does it lead to violence? Does it lead to fear? What does anger actually translate to for me? And another thing that I found really useful is looking into shadow work, and what kind of experiences do I have with anger in my shadow, with those feelings of, or beliefs that anger is somehow inherently wrong, that it's something that I have to shy away from. Do I view myself as an angry person? And if I do view myself as an angry person, what does that mean for me? I think a couple of the questions that you can ask yourself surrounding anger in particular are, do I try to avoid anger? And if I do try to avoid anger, what does that look like for me? What does that mean for me? Do I have that avoidance around it? Does anger make me anxious? Is that something that I have learned over the years? And I think as well, looking at what kind of things make you feel angry and how that transpires for you. Why do these things make you look angry? For example, for me, when people misunderstand me and refuse to accept that I've given them an explanation, and this happened so many times on this particular post that I've been talking about in this episode, where I gave what I thought was a really succinct, polite explanation that tried to validate their feelings whilst also maintaining my stance and not kind of being pushed into going, oh yes, you're right, I will change everything, and fawning to them. And yet they got angrier and angrier with me and completely misunderstood the whole purpose of the piece of content. I found that really frustrating. And I found myself getting angry in response because they were what I perceived as willfully misunderstanding me. And that goes back to all those times that I have been gaslit by my mum, by previous partners, and told that the way I feel about things is wrong. So being misunderstood for me carries a whole bundle of baggage around it. That's when I feel angry. But a safer response for me was to either internalize that as anger on myself, or to squash that anger and allow it to come out in people pleasing. So that's one of the ways in which I have a relationship with anger and how I've navigated anger in the past. So looking into those experiences can be really helpful for learning to understand where we're coming from with certain responses and why we have problems with certain responses. And another note on that internalizing anger, I did a mirror exercise once where you have to stare into the mirror and you just look at yourself and you allow emotions to come to the surface whilst you are observing yourself. Sounds really kooky and a little bit crazy, but actually mirror gazing is a well-documented way to consider self-reflection, to build self-awareness, and to do some shadow work. And I kept looking in this mirror, and what came up, and it really took me aback because I didn't expect it to, were these feelings of anger towards myself. How could I have allowed this situation with my parent to have gone on? How could I have seen our relationship in a different light? How have I allowed relationships with partners, with friends throughout the years to have been also so abusive? Maybe I'm the problem. And all these feelings of anger towards me started to bubble up. And it was only when I could sit with that and start to address that and look at it and say, wow, actually, you carry quite a bit of anger, and it's no surprise that you feel so conflicting with anger, when so many of these feelings are feelings that have been either put on you or you've been taught to feel them towards yourself, when actually my anger was very valid towards my mum. My anger was very valid towards ex-partners, towards friends, towards other relationships where I haven't been treated fairly, but all of it was coming back on me. How could you allow this to happen? And that was a bit of a breakthrough moment for me. It was when I started to really unpick that and say, hang on a minute, where should this anger be going? Is it valid? And how can I express that safely and securely? Doesn't necessarily mean that I've got to get in touch with someone else and speak to them and tell them how angry I am with them. I might be able to journal on that, write in a letter, whatever that might look like. But that anger is valid, and I have to stop avoiding it and trying to squash it down or trying to flip it onto myself, because I've not done anything wrong in this situation. And that's okay to acknowledge too. The anger doesn't always have to be directed at me. Again, remember, this all might look completely different for you, but in asking yourself these reflective questions and considering, it can help you to open up your relationship with different emotions and what they might mean for you. And I found it to be a really healing and cathartic experience, and found it to be something that's allowed me to lean into more emotions, allowed me to challenge the things that don't serve me, like fawning, allowed me to express my anger in a healthy way, apart from when the cat litter tray explodes on me, in which case that was, you know, the slipper was not necessarily healthy anger, but I didn't throw it at anybody, so a win is a win. A win is a win. Just on the floor, and then felt like a complete wally. But that different kind of reaction that we can learn to lean into, that we can learn to create a healthier relationship with, I think is really important. And that is where I'm going to end this episode, guys. I hope that you have found it useful. And if you do want to go and have a look at that Instagram, that community is ever growing over there. And it's so helpful to have that community healing, to be able to see how many people relate to these experiences, how many people have grown up within dysfunction, and how we can talk about it so that we don't have to have the same experiences for our children and for their children. We can break these cycles and create healthier, happier relationships. And I'd say as well, there are plenty of people over on that platform who have relationships with their parents and have managed to come to a much healthier point in their lives with boundaries, and managed to reach a space where they can have a functioning relationship. And there are people over there who do not have a relationship with parents. Both are absolutely okay, both are welcome, and all experiences are welcome there, even when you are disagreeing with me. And that's the unfollowing_mum page on Instagram. Thanks for listening, guys. I will speak to you again next week. Bye.